Hello, and welcome to our program, Slavery in America. My name is Melissa Dalton, and I am the Public Outreach Coordinator for the Greene County Record Center and Archives. Today, we're going to be learning about slavery in America, and specifically here in Greene County. But before we get into that, I would like to tell you a little bit about our institution. The Greene County Record Center and Archives was founded in 1996, and we have records that date back to 1803. And we hold the historical records for the county. So any records that were created within any department that are deemed historical, we're going to hold them. Now, like I said, our records date back to 1803, and that's because Greene County was founded in 1803, the same year as Ohio. And it actually went all the way up to Lake Erie when it was first founded. And it didn't gain its current borders until 1819. So when you come into our facility, you're going to be sitting in what we call our reading room, which you'll see is in that top left-hand corner. So the types of records that you would find if you're going to be doing research in our facility, you're going to be using records maybe like probate, which would include estates, wills, marriage, adoption, birth, and death records. We also have clerk of court records, which will include divorce, early naturalizations, crime and disputes. We also have tax records, deeds and mortgage records, and survey records. And most of those, you'll see a lot of our different materials, especially if you're looking in our reading room, are bound. But if you go into our stacks, which is our main storage area, you're going to notice that they're mostly in boxes. And this section of our facility is not open to the public. So if you needed a record that was back here, you'd have to ask for it. And the reason we keep these records back here are it could be security reasons. We also keep records back here because if they're in a file, we don't want them to get mixed up. If someone tries to refile something, maybe they would accidentally put it in the wrong folder. Also, if we have records that are starting to deteriorate, maybe they're starting to get torn or break down, the paper's becoming brittle, we'll keep these in the back as well for just a little bit of extra security and preservation measures. So today we're going to be talking about slavery. And we're going to actually learn about a slave family, actually two, that came here to Greene County, where they were brought here. Either they were set free here or they were freed beforehand and came here. But they both settled here in Greene County. But before we really get into that, I want you guys to examine this photograph. And I wanted you guys to take note about what do you see, what do you notice about this photograph. So go ahead and take a few minutes and discuss. You probably noticed some of the same things we did. So it's a small shack. There's some dirt floors. The people's clothes, they look a little ragged. Some people are wearing shoes, some aren't. And there's a lot of people in a small space. See, as a slave, you were really given the bare minimum to survive. So you might have been given clothing, you might have been given food and shelter, but it was very minimal. So you had to provide for yourself mostly. So many slaves worked anywhere from 12 to 14 hours a day, 6 days a week. And so in the little bit of time they had to take steps to make sure that they could find and fend for themselves. So that might be fishing, it might be hunting, they might have had to grow in a small garden. That was all after working long hours in the fields. So what is a slave? A slave is a person who had no rights. They were seen as property, as for most people. They had no legal rights, so they couldn't protest if they were treated poorly by their slave owners. They couldn't testify in courts. They could be killed or beaten or abused without any consequences. So a lot of times slaves were allowed to marry and have children, but it was at the owner's discretion. They had the choice to decide whether or not to give them that permission to marry. But the slave marriages had no legal protections. So families could be bought and sold and separated. So children of slaves would take on the legal status of their mother. So that means that if their mother was a slave, then the child would be a slave, even if the father was free. See, and slave owners saw this as an advantage because the more children their female slaves had, that meant the more wealth they had because they saw it as an investment in their future. The more slaves meant that more work could be done. However, the owner, like I said, had complete control over what happened to the families. So they could be separated and sold, and there was be no input from the slaves themselves. And slaves actually could be as young as 4 years old. So maybe they were taking water to the fields, they were tending to animals in gardens, or helping with younger children. Maybe they were learning a new trade. But on average, slaves started working at about 7 years old, and that would include the 12 to 14 hours a day, 6 days a week. So something to think about is, and discuss between yourselves, what were you doing at 7 years old? What's the difference? Well, like we said, a slave is owned by a slave owner. And there were many times that a slave owner would be violent towards their slaves. And so what you guys might want to be asking is, why is this? So I want you guys to take a couple minutes and talk about what you think, why they would be doing this to each other or to their slaves. So many times the slaves outnumbered their slave owners. So actually, by the violence towards their slaves could be an attempt to show their power and authority, and that was one way to do it. So if you beat a slave for doing something or not working hard enough, or at least in your eyes, if you do it in front of the other slaves, what's the likelihood that they're going to do it? It's pretty slim, isn't it? So they needed to show their slaves that if they did step out of line, that there would be punishment, and that punishment could be quite severe. And so in the end, it was really a way to continue their way of life, the slave owner's way of life. Now, many slaves worked on a plantation. So what's a plantation? It's just a large farm, a very large farm, large scale. And in the South, they really specialized in particular crops. Do you guys know what those crops are? Raise your hand and you guys can point them out. There are 5 main ones. Those 5 main crops are cotton, tobacco, sugar, indigo, and rice. So those are the big ones in the South. So when we're thinking about the violence and abusive nature of slave owners, many felt that, and they were correct to believe that their livelihood, their way of life, was really dependent on the slaves and them doing the work for them in the fields. Otherwise, if you were paying those slaves, you're going to have less money in your own pocket, aren't you? So it was a way for them to get the work done and keep more money for themselves and keep their way of life. Now you'll see here we talk about how slaves weren't really allowed to go to school. And what are some reasons for that? I want you guys to discuss what you think are some reasons they wouldn't want you to go to school. Go ahead and press pause and talk about it for a second. The reason they didn't want their slaves to learn how to read or write was because it was a way for them to gain freedom, actually. The more that they read, the more that they were able to write. It provided them a way to communicate with the outside of their current situation. So they were able to communicate with people outside, maybe communicate with other family members. And the more literate you were, it made it more difficult to control the slaves, and maybe they were more likely to run away. It was also a way to, a lot of slaves would maybe write slave narratives, and these slave narratives would talk about the brutality and how abusive slave owners could be towards their slaves. And these stories of their lives would be published in newspapers in the North. And in many places, the slave owners didn't like that. They didn't want to be portrayed that way. So it was also a way to keep those types of stories from getting out. And in many states, like I said, it was even illegal to teach a slave how to read or write. And those that did teach them, they could be fined, they could be imprisoned, or they could even be whipped. Now, the consequences for a slave being caught learning how to read or write, or even reading and writing, it could be much more severe. They could be beaten, some would be killed, and some they would even amputate. They would cut off their fingers or their toes because it was a way to show them or to keep them from doing it anymore. Oh, it was also a lesson, in quotes, to the other slaves, showing them that if you do this, this is what's going to happen to you. So this is a map of 1861 of the United States. And do you guys know what's happening in 1861? Or happening, had just started, a major event in the United States? Right, it's the Civil War. So the Civil War had just started. And you can see on this map, it breaks down the different territories and states that were free versus slave. Um, most of them in the South there are the slave states. Most of them required or really relied on the agriculture, on the farming to make money to have their way of life, basically. Um, so they really needed the slaves in their eyes, because if they didn't, then they weren't going to have make as much money, and they weren't going to be able to really sustain their way of lives that way. Um, Now you can see here that Ohio is a free state. Um, and honestly, I also would like to talk about a little bit about the Underground Railroad, and I'm sure most of you know what it is. So, what is it? You guys take a second and discuss it. The Underground Railroad was a vast network of people um, who helped fugitive slaves escape to the north and ultimately even to Canada in some respects. But it was done by African Americans, although there were white Caucasian people involved as well. There's actually an estimate that claims that roughly 100,000 slaves escaped to the South between 1810 and 1850. Um, but now I really want to talk about Ohio. So we know Ohio's free. You know, you could not own a slave in Ohio. That was part of the Ohio's constitution. It made slavery illegal in the state. However, that doesn't mean that slaves or freed African Americans were treated as equals. So in 1804, Ohio actually passed a series of laws called the Black Laws. And these required that anybody who was black or mulatto, which is a historical term, it's not one we use today, but it means biracial. They had to furnish these certificates of freedom from the courts. And these certificates would have to be presented to the courts before they could settle in Ohio. And so you had to register your name, your children's name, and there was a fee involved. And the fee wasn't so bad in the beginning. But it actually, within a few years, they made the laws even stricter. And now they had to find two people who would guarantee in a bond, so they would pay a fee um, that of $500, which is roughly $8,000 today. That this African American, they would say that this African American will be on their best behavior. They will not be a burden on society in Ohio. And you have to have at least two people do this for you. So that's a lot of money for somebody who isn't making any money. And so they would have to come up with this money. Also, there were other law. This law also limited their rights to marry, their rights to own property, their rights to own guns. There was a lot of different restrictions put into place for African Americans in Ohio. So it doesn't mean just because you were moving to Ohio or you were coming to Ohio that your life was going to be great. So some slaves were actually freed by their owners. And I want you guys to talk about for a second, what do you think are some reasons that a slave owner would free their slaves? Right, so there are a lot of different reasons that a slave owner may have freed their slaves. And they're actually the word we use for a slave owner who is freeing their slave, we would call it manumission. So, manumission is the act of an owner freeing their slave, whereas emancipation is the process of being set free or liberated. So, there's a lot of the words are usually used interchangeably, so you'll hear them a lot. But manumission is the act of the owner actually freeing their slave. So, you'll actually hear that word here in a few minutes. So there might be reasons for them to emancipate their slaves, would be maybe a form of gratitude that they've worked hard over the years. They've put in the effort and the time that the slave owner had requested, and so now they're going to free them. But it also could be a way of, again, showing their power and their authority, saying, well, if you work really hard for me for a few more years, I'll set you free. Although that doesn't mean they had to follow that. There was no binding contract here. It wasn't like there's this word, their word meant ultimately that they had to do it. Um, it could also be seen as a way to motivate them to work harder. They might free them due to their age, so maybe they were considered no longer useful. And a lot of times, if a slave was getting older, maybe they weren't going to be able to sell them and make that money, make that return, so they would set them free. It also could be that they didn't agree with slavery. Maybe they inherited the slaves from a family member and they didn't agree with it, or maybe their life had changed enough that they didn't believe in slavery anymore, and that they would free them on their own accord because of those feelings. So let's actually talk about Laura Smith and her family. Laura Smith was a slave from Mississippi, and her owner brought her here to Greene County and emancipated her. And so she came here with her 7 children in 1858. So remember, when Laura arrived, Ohio law required her to register with the courts. So Laura had to register with the courts and to show her freedom papers. So let's look at her registration record, which was filed on July 22nd, 1858. So this is Laura's freedom paper. And we actually have this at the archives. Let's read through this. All right, her freedom paper states, whereas William F. Smith of Washington County, Mississippi, has this day at the County of Greene and State of Ohio, by his own voluntary act and by bringing the persons hereinafter named into the said State of Ohio, manumitted, let free, enfranchised, and liberated from all service and servitude to the said Smith, the following named persons, who were hereintofor his servants or slaves for life by the laws of the said State of Mississippi. So what is he saying here? Right, remember the word manumitted means setting free. And so he's saying here that he is freeing Laura and the other named persons. So it goes on to say, Laura Smith, age 32 years, mother of the following named children. Said Laura is a mulatto woman, 3/4 white, mole on right cheek, and scar on the left forehead, about 5 feet 2 inches high. William Smith, aged 18 years, light complected, black hair, and high cheekbones. James Dick Smith, age 16, very light complected, hair dark brown. And it goes on to describe the rest of the children. So why so much detail? So let's think of this like an identification. So maybe think of it like a license, a driver's license, a passport. Basically, it was a way for them to identify her and her children. And if they read that, then they would know this is Laura. The description matches the person standing in front of me. That is the hope with a freedom paper. But it didn't ultimately mean just because you were carrying a freedom paper that you couldn't be taken into custody or sold back into slavery. But it actually did limit that possibility, at least some. So let's really think about Laura, and let's do a little activity. So using the transcript that you have in front of you, and it's the same information that I just read to you, I want you guys to draw what you think Laura looked like based on that description that was provided. So you can keep reading over this and use that as your guide when you're drawing Laura. So add whatever details you think are necessary. You can do it in color if you have colored pencils or markers. Take the time that you need, and we can come back and we can see how we drew her. All right, so this is how we drew Laura. Remember, she was about 5'2". She was a mother, so there's a baby in there. There is a mole on her and a scar, although we did put them on the wrong sides, as you'll notice. They should be the other way, the mole and the scar. And most likely her hair and clothing are probably wrong, but this is just kind of give you guys an idea. Now, remember, Laura came from Mississippi. So her and her family traveled over 800 miles to get to Ohio, to Greene County in particular. That's a pretty long distance for Laura and her 7 children to travel. Now, we're also going to learn about another person, former slave. His name was Godfrey Brown. And Godfrey Brown actually came from Virginia and settled here in Greene County. So let's start learning a little bit about Godfrey. Now, one might ask, before we get into learning about Mr. Brown's stories, why Greene County, Ohio? Why did people come here? There's actually a few reasons, but I want you guys to take a minute and discuss, why do you think people came to Greene County? There are a couple of main reasons. One is Greene County had inexpensive, fertile farmland. And remember that most of your slaves did work on plantations originally, so it made it a good transition for them. They were already well equipped to do that type of work, farming work. Additionally, Greene County was an abolitionist community, meaning that they were against slavery. So felt like they would be more welcome in such a community. So to learn about Godfrey Brown, we're going to do a little exercise. We're going to actually create a timeline of his life. So here we have the information, so the dates with some details about what happened during that date. And we're going to use those to fill in this timeline. So let's go to the next slide. So here we are with our timeline. So go ahead and fill in the title with Godfrey Brown and the Brown Settlement. And I want somebody to raise their hand and say, what do you think is the first date and description of that first date we're going to use on this timeline? Right, the first date is 1768. And in 1768, Godfrey Brown was born into slavery in Virginia. So what's the next date we're going to fill in? Remember, we're going to fill in that first bottom one. Right, 1798. In 1798, Godfrey earns money by working for other planters while a slave in Virginia. Godfrey's only 30 years old at this time, so he's still fairly young. But after working, remember I said at the beginning, 12 to 14 hours a day, 6 days a week. In the little bit of free time that Godfrey Brown had, he was working outside of that time to actually try to make money so that he could buy his and his family's freedom. So what's the next date we're going to enter? The next date is 1820. In 1820, Godfrey and his family pay $5,650 for their freedom. Now, I want you guys to think about this for a second. So, how old is Godfrey Brown now? That's right, Godfrey Brown is 52 years old now, which means it took him how many years to save up that much money? Right. It took him 22 years to save up $5,650. Now, today, that amount, $5,650, equals $104,595. So $104,595 today. That's a lot of money for him to save up for his and his family's freedom. So what's the next date on this slide? The next one's a little tricky. All right, there's two 1822s. So it's going to be the 1822 where the family moves from Virginia to Greene County, Ohio. And on the journey north, the family brings horses, household items, and money hidden in a tobacco box. So the family starts heading to Ohio about 2 years after they buy their freedom. So the next one is going to be the 1822. So in 1822, once they get here, the family buys land in Greene County and they name it the Brown Settlement. So what's the next one on there? What's the next date we're going to choose? All right, the next date is circa 1830. Does anyone know what circa means? Circa means about, around. So about or around 1830. The family buys a church, a log school, and a cemetery on the land. So really, within about 8 years of moving to Greene County, this family has already become a pillar within the community, a very strong member of the community. They're providing a lot for their community members even. And like I said, there's a church, a log school, and a cemetery. So what's the last date that we're going to put on our timeline? The last date is 1843. And in 1843, Godfrey Brown died, and he was buried at Brown Cemetery, in their family's plot. So Godfrey Brown was how old when he died? He was 75 years old. So Godfrey Brown lived roughly 23 years as a freed man. And 75 years old is a pretty good age, especially in the mid-1800s. So he lived a decent life. And he was pretty well known and very well liked within the community at large. So we've learned a bit about Godfrey Brown. We've learned a bit about Laura Smith. And these are just two of the families that actually settled here in Greene County. So there were actually a lot of different families that did come to Greene County for those reasons we mentioned before. So we hope that you guys all enjoyed our program today. Thank you very much. I did include some resources here. So we have a website where we have some different resources for student activities and educational activities. We do a weekly blog post. So if you want to learn a little bit more about African Americans within our community, other prominent members of the community, or different events that have happened, we do a weekly blog post that provides some of that information. We also do Facebook and Instagram, Twitter, and we do those almost daily. And on Flickr, we have actually a link to our emancipation records, which are the records we use today to learn about Godfrey and Laura. So we hope that you will check out some of those other resources, and we hope you enjoyed the program. Thank you very much, and have a great day.